A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
It started innocently enough, the kind of exhaustion that wraps around your bones like a heavy blanket when you have a newborn. But by the time my daughter turned 3 months old, I found myself battling something far more sinister than sleep deprivation. It was the night I first heard the whisper, soft and slippery like a serpent slithering through my mind. I was alone in the nursery, rocking Sophie gently in my arms, her tiny body nestled against my chest when I heard it, barely above a whisper, "Tch, let me out." At first, I thought it must have been the moonlight playing tricks on me, a figment conjured by fatigue, but as the song on the baby monitor stuttered and switched to static, it repeated, "Let me out." Panic clawed at my chest, urging me to escape the nursery, but I couldn't leave my baby, not for anything. I forced a laugh, telling myself it was just the creaking of the old wooden beams. I made new excuses each night, the wind, the old neighbor's haunted house, anything to convince myself I wasn't unraveling. It persisted, creeping in at unexpected moments. I later realized I could hear it even when I wasn't in the nursery. Room after room, all while Sophie slept peacefully in her crib, as if oblivious to the dark presence spiraling around us. It became almost routine. I'd be washing dishes or folding laundry, the whisper would emerge, slithering through my thoughts, a ghost of sound coaxing me, "You have to do it." One evening, lulled by exhausted delirium, I found myself standing in front of the mirror in the bathroom, my voice trembling as I repeated the words out loud, "Let me out. Let me out." It was then that I caught sight of Sophie's reflection behind me, her innocent blue eyes wide and unblinking, gazing at me like I'd lost my mind. That night marked a turning point. Out of desperation to escape the eerie voice, I began yelling at Sophie, "Close your mouth. Don't lose it." So clueless to what I was doing. My frantic words seeped into the nursery's quiet as the whisper warped around them, draping the space in shadows, thick like fog. I remembered feeling guilty, but every time I opened my mouth, it was as if the darker side of me took control, and it didn't even want to stop at the yelling, it needed to dominate. "What do you want?" I shouted into the nursery one night, the air thick with tension as Sophie's gaze shifted toward the dark corner where the light barely reached. The whisper laughed, that soft, gravelly sound curling through the silence of the room. "You know what I want, dear. You just need to give in." I brushed off my fears by telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks, a stress-induced figment born from midnight feedings and a growing sense of helplessness I felt as a new parent. I sat down at Sophie's crib, looking at her sleeping face, and as if she sensed my panic, she stirred, a little whimper escaping her tiny mouth. I shushed her, and for a moment, everything felt okay again. That was until I was jolted from the reverie by the sound of my own voice murmuring, "You can keep it. Just don't let it go." The chilling realization coursed through me, I was saying things I couldn't remember even thinking. The next day, a desperate attempt to regain control led me to the local bookstore, where I buried my head in parenting books, seeking answers to the madness clawing away at my mind. I would hear parents talk about the stresses of newborn life, but as I desperately scanned the titles, my ears strained for the voice to cease. When I finally got home, I locked the bedroom door, hoping to drown it out with the blissful sounds of Sophie gurgling. But it wasn't enough, the darkness bled into every thought, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something waiting, something that wanted to take Sophie from me. As weeks passed, I devised a new plan, no more letting her cry, no more leaving her alone in the room. I would constantly be vigilant like a guard. But the nights grew longer, and I felt tension creeping in around the edges of our lives like a slow poison, simmering until it erupted into anger and helplessness. I couldn't look my husband in the eye anymore, he could see the panic clawing at me and tried to reach out. I pulled away. "You don't understand." I screamed one night, tears streaming down my face, "You haven't heard it." My voice grew louder, spitting shards of my fear into the walls, but he only stepped back, bewildered, confused. I couldn't articulate it to him. Sometimes I thought Sophie felt the presence too, as I watched her stare into the dark corners of the room, her mouth opening like she was trying to speak with whatever lurked there. It felt like I was tumbling into madness, a dark tunnel with no end in sight. One night, I finally cracked under the pressure. I stood over her crib, screaming into the void, "Do not let it out. Close your mouth, Sophie." My heart raced as her sleepy eyes blinked up at me, the fragile innocence of her gaze slicing through the thick haze of despair. I thought I saw a flicker of recognition, a moment where she understood, but then the whisper swelled, wrapping around us both, "She's mine, you know." In that moment, nothing else mattered. I swept Sophie from her crib, cradling her against my chest, desperate to shield her from the dark force that haunted me. I yelled at shadows, I yelled at the whispers, my voice rising in terror as I paced the dark house. That night, as I yelled and begged for it to leave us alone, the air grew cold, and the seals on my sanity began to crack. The last thing I remember is cradling Sophie close, her tiny mouth opening in a yawn, and for the first time, I realized it wasn't just me suffering, it was her too. The corners of my vision darkened, and I felt myself slipping away when that horrible whisper echoed in my head once more, "You've done well. Just a little more, and she will be mine." I released a desperate howl, my heart pounding, and then, silence. The next morning, I found myself in the living room, mysterious scratches running down my arms, and Sophie curled peacefully in her crib as if nothing had ever happened, her mouth shut tight. I looked into her eyes and felt something shift. It was gone. I don't know how long it had been, but perhaps, just perhaps, the battle wasn't over. And even now, each creak of the house at night makes my heart race. I can still hear the whisper sometimes, lurking around the corners of my mind, and I can't help but think the day will come when I'll have to face the darkness fully. All I can do is keep my daughter close and keep screaming the same words day in and day out. Close your mouth. Don't let it out. I called my mom ugly, and it's my biggest regret to this day. I thought it was just a stupid, careless joke in a moment of teenage angst, but as the words slipped out of my mouth, I immediately felt the air in the room shift, palpable and heavy, and the look on her face was something I can still recall with heartbreaking clarity. She stood frozen, her eyes wide as if I had physically struck her, and for a second time stood silent, just waiting in stunned disbelief, and in that moment it dawned on me that I had crossed a line I hadn't even known existed, but by then it was too late and I shuffled back to my room, blissfully unaware of the consequences my reckless words would bring. It wasn't until days later when I awoke to find my mom sitting on the edge of my bed, her face pale and drawn, the light in her eyes dimmer than I had ever seen, and she simply whispered that she was sorry, that she loved me and would always be there for me, even if I didn't realize the weight of my words, and I brushed it off because that's just what kids do. They don't understand the intricate web of family dynamics, the way a mother's love is woven into every thread of life, and how brutal it feels to have that love weaponized by a careless child. Weeks turned into months, and life rolled on in its chaotic rhythm, but I was blinded by my own self-importance, still too consumed with fitting in with my friends to notice that each day seemed to sap a little more of her vitality, every laugh sounding a tad emptier, every meal we shared becoming a chore instead of a cherished moment, and finally, one day, she didn't come to my soccer game. I remember glancing at the stands and feeling that my heart raced a little too fast, a little too out of sync, but then the game rolled on, and I forced the worried thought from my mind because, hey, kids are stupid, and I was no exception. When I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread clinging to my heart like a heavy fog, and my father met me at the door with this look that I hadn't seen before, not the stern or stressed expression I was used to, but something like resignation, almost defeat, and he told me that my mom was unwell, that she had taken some time off work, which only added to my gut-wrenching anxiety. As I walked into the house and saw her lying on the couch, pale and fragile, the woman who'd once effortlessly juggled everything now reduced to a shadow of her former self, flanked by a cocoon of blankets and a silence so vast it pressed down on me like gravity, I sat beside her, and in that moment, everything I had said echoed back, became the refrain of a heart-rending song, and though I tried to summon the bravery to apologize, words got caught like thorns in my throat, and I just watched as she turned her head to me, her eyes shimmering with tears she wouldn't let fall. And I let the moment stretch painfully long before magically it started to rain outside, drenching the world in melancholic rhythm. Drowning out anything I thought might slip past those thorns, my summer turned into an agonizing cycle of visiting her mostly vacant room, watching the sun rise and set without her laughter spilling into the warm air, and the visits from the doctors, each one weighing heavier than the last, until one evening, the worst of them all arrived as my father's face crumbled under the pressure of delivering the news that the doctors had diagnosed her. It was an advanced stage of cancer, and they didn't know how long she had left. I stood in shock, processing each word like pieces of a jigsaw, desperately grasping tightly to a sliver of hope that it was one big mistake. But as the days rolled into each other again, the realization settled heavy on my chest like a boulder, and my heart twisted painfully with guilt for the ugly words I had hurled at the one person who had given me life, whose beauty had always outshone the superficial, and it was too late for apologies. Too late to take it back because that wound had buried itself deep within her, taking root and spreading faster than I could ever comprehend. Time folded into itself again, and amid the gradual, agonizing decline, I vowed to make it up to her, began scribbling notes of affection, pouring my heart into clumsy odes of appreciation, surrounding her with drawings and photos from happier times, but nothing was enough, and the sweet moments became few and far between, overshadowed by increasingly frequent hospital visits and the increasing realization that her skin was stretching and sallow and the laughter I cherished ebbed further away, and on one particularly dreary morning, a phone call shattered the already thin veneer of my world, the voice on the other end a stranger unrecognizable, delivering the final blow. "I'm sorry, but your mother passed away peacefully in her sleep," and everything fell silent. My heart stopped as if it had unplugged from life itself, and suddenly I was wrapped in an overwhelming swirl of grief and guilt, an ironic knot that tightened around me, choking my breath in labored gasps and drowning my mind in a cacophony of memories I didn't think I'd have to live without, of the woman who wiped my tears as a child, whose love wove through my existence and who I had ridiculed so carelessly. Days blurred into nights as I fought my own mind, trapped in a loop of imagined scenarios where I spoke to her one last time, told her how beautiful she really was, begged her to forgive me for my outburst that day, until I could taste the bitterness of regret on my tongue, a flavor I would carry with me forever because no matter how much time passed, I could scarcely breathe without wrestling with my regret, something so weighty it felt as if it would crush me beneath its seismic force, and as the years dragged on, I found myself hoping for a fleeting glimpse of her, some sign that she knew how much I loved her, but instead, I was left with only shadows of a past that whispered to me in dreams. So vivid they felt real, laced with her laughter that always followed with the gnawing reminder of that ugly word I had said. Every evening, I would catch myself standing at her grave, tears streaming down my cheeks as I begged for forgiveness, haunted by the visage of her smile that was now nothing but a distant whisper. This is where I remind you, don't ever take for granted the precious moments, the love wrapped in the mundane, and never say something you might later regret, because it may just be your last chance to tell them they are beautiful, and that you love them. After all, it was the last lesson I learned way too late. The scars that linger can outlast even death. When I cradled my son in my arms for the first and last time, his fragile body swathed in gauzy hospital blankets, I knew each breath he took was borrowed time, punctuated by beeping monitors and hushed whispers from solemn doctors, a chorus of grief I had never signed up for. They offered platitudes about hope and possibility, but I could see the truth in their eyes. My little boy, born with a heart too weak for this world, was a ghost before he had even begun to live. Holding him close, I felt an unexpected wave of relief wash over me, not at the thought of his impending death, but at the realization that I'd be spared the agony of watching him fight for a life that might never be whole. I recalled other parents roaming the hospital halls, eyes red and hollow, possessing both the wicked fortune and burden of watching their children struggle against a torrent of tubes and ventilators, their laughter replaced by agonizing silence. I had heard tales, just whispers, really, of parents who vowed to devote every waking moment to their child's care, to be warriors in the name of love, but who would be left with nothing but echoes of despair once their battles ended. I've even seen a few of them break, kneeling in the linoleum of the waiting room, cursing God for taking away what was supposed to be good, furiously questioning why their children were chosen to suffer. But for me, an odd sort of peace spread through my veins with each heartbeat in my son's tiny chest. I was grateful the doctors couldn't fix him, that I wouldn't have to watch as he underwent endless surgeries, struggling for a future that could be more painful than beautiful. As I gazed down at his face, a perfect little button nose and wispy tufts of dark hair, I thought about how I would have fought for him, but also how I truly believed I would have lost a piece of my soul as I pieced together our shattered lives, watching him grow through a lens of fear and uncertainty, living each day in a state of anxious fragility. A few hours passed and the sterile smell of antiseptic began to blend with something darker, a weight creeping into the room that made me question everything I thought I knew. It was then that I first felt the cold chill on my spine, a sensation like icy fingers tracing down my back. The air thickened and turned electric, and despite the low hum of hospital machinery, I could swear I heard a low whisper just beyond the threshold of consciousness. I looked up, my heart racing, but the room remained empty except for the flickering lights above. I shook my head and tried to brush it off, but the unease lingered, wrapping around me like a shroud. The murmurs returned, the fading voices growing into something more coherent, a woman's voice from somewhere deep inside my mind, pleading in a sorrowful whisper that I should let him go, that he was never meant to be here. The words rumbled through me like thunder, and I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to remain tethered to reality, but a sudden thought pierced through, a memory of a conversation I'd had with the doctors just a day earlier when they weren't so certain this would be the end. They'd mentioned a treatment, a last-ditch effort to save him, but when I caught a glimpse of those heavy, haunted expressions, I knew deep down I would never be able to go through with it. I blinked hard, glancing back down at my son, watching as the rhythmic beeping slowed to a mournful dirge. Dense shadows danced on the walls, encroaching from every angle, and in my stillness, I became aware of the hollow, haunting laughter echoing faintly through the room, as if someone was mocking my anguish. Time warped, stretching and bending until I could no longer tell if I had been in the room for minutes or hours. My son's face started to drain of color, losing its warmth. The whispering intensified, a surrounding cacophony of unearthly wails and familiar voices filled my ears, and in that moment, I felt a tugging sensation, a cosmic pull that offered only one choice. The air grew heavy, tainted with the scent of rotting flowers, and every instinct screamed at me to run, to escape whatever madness this was before it swallowed me whole. But then, as if compelled by an unknown force, I found myself leaning closer to my son, burying my face against his forehead, feeling the last vestiges of warmth leak away. The whispers crescendoed into chaotic shrieking, swirling around my head until I couldn't think straight, and it was then that I understood, every harrowing tale I had heard about haunting could stem from a place of sorrow, a place where grief disallowed closure, the fear of losing a child morphing into a haunting curse. And then, suddenly, the cacophony faded to a whisper. My son's heart monitor echoed one final beep, signaling the end. In that instant, I felt something dark settle around my heart, but a warmth bubbled beneath it. At last, freedom. I was released from the prison of eternal worry, and as he slipped from my grasp, his fragile soul now free from this world, I was no longer bound by the heavy chains of expectation. Yet, the emptiness that followed wrapped around me like a fog, and I couldn't help but wonder if the joy of release was worth the price of living in a world haunted by memories I would never escape. Even now, days after he passed, I can still hear the woman's voice in my dreams, soft and sweet, beckoning me to join him, to let go of everything and start anew. And though the crushing grief threatens to consume me, part of me wonders, if I had just so eagerly wanted this release, should I perhaps follow where the darkness leads? So, yes, in a warped sense, I find solace in knowing he didn't have to suffer long enough for his life to bring pain. He left, and I am left with the remnants of his laughter echoing through the emptiness of my heart, a heart now prepared to follow him into the dark. I don't always come home from work straight away. I pull over somewhere and chill for an hour or so. It started as a harmless habit, a way to decompress after an exhausting day at the call center, where the sound of my voice droning through endless customer complaints blurred my sense of self. I found this rundown park on the outskirts of town that nobody seemed to visit, an oasis of disconnection, with its crooked picnic tables and the hollow echo of silence. It became my refuge. At first, I'd play solitaire on my phone or scroll aimlessly through social media, but as the sun dipped below the horizon and the park descended into a veil of shadow, I began to notice the transformations of the landscape around me. One evening, as I kicked pebbles on the path, a flicker of movement caught my eye. A figure in a faded brown hoodie, its face obscured, stood by the edge of the woods. I waved, half-heartedly expecting them to retreat into the thicket, but they merely stared, their eyes glinting unnaturally in the dim light. Rather than panic, a strange sense of calm enveloped me, as if they were a part of the scenery, another shade of night creeping into my world. I convinced myself it wasn't a big deal, that I'd simply imagined the whole encounter from spending too much time alone. But after that, every time I parked at the old lot, I felt a pulse of energy in the air, a whisper of unseen eyes watching me from behind the trees. The figure returned again, always motionless, always just out of reach. I learned their routine. On Tuesdays, they'd be there just as the sun vanished, and on Thursdays, they'd be gone before I settled into my usual spot. I started rearranging my schedule, choosing to leave work late, my heart racing with anticipation when I finally saw them, little more than a shadow, yet almost magnetic in their stillness. I began to stay longer, often pushing past the hour mark, drawn to the thrill of the unknown, the urge to understand what this specter wanted from me. But as the weeks crept on, dread seeped into my fascination. One chilly evening, the figure approached the car, slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly okay with the distance that loomed between us. Their hoodie hung loosely, hiding all but the faint outline of their body. My heart thumped. I contemplated leaving, revving my engine, but my curiosity swelled into something louder, compelling me to stay. I rolled down my window, hesitating like a fool, and asked, "Who are you?" The figure simply cocked its head, and in that moment, I could almost feel the trees lean in, as if they were waiting for the answer just as much as I was. They drew closer, the rustling leaves around them amplifying a tension I couldn't quite escape, and finally spoke. "You leave them every night, don't you?" The words sliced through the crisp air, chilling me to the bone. I stammered, grappling with the unexpected emotion that washed over me, an unsettling mix of recognition and fear. "No, I don't," I protested. But the figure merely smiled, though I could not see their lips move beneath the fabric of the hoodie. Is that what you tell yourself? I didn't understand, yet I felt strings pulling, colors swirling in my mind as if fate had rewinded a terrible secret from my past, something I'd tossed in a box deep within my mind. As if my insides churned, the memories streamed in, late phone calls, neglected promises, and unmade decisions that had haunted me ever since my brother vanished without a trace 5 years ago. My throat tightened, breath caught in a web of regret as I gripped the steering wheel, eyes wide, seeking clarity in the dim light cast by my headlights. That night, I drove home feeling heavy, yet light, like I'd peeled a layer of myself off. The figure hadn't been a stranger but a haunting memory shaped like a person, a catalyst for the guilt I bore in silence. I tried to shake the sensation, but it crept back, a relentless specter in my mind. Days turned into weeks, and every time I parked at the lot, the figure seemed to glide between my thoughts and the reality outside my window. They became a linkage to the sense of hope I had lost somewhere in my brother's absence. On the occasions when I neglected to visit the park and rushed home, I could almost feel their expectant gaze on my back, coaxing me to return, to confront what I was running from. My co-workers began noticing my changing demeanor, whispers of concern circling their conversations, but I brushed them off, convincing myself I was fine, that this was just a way to reclaim a portion of myself lost to grief. One particularly frigid night, after a hellish shift, I felt a summons nearly magnetic, driving me to the park with a purpose that I could no longer deny. My heart pounded in anticipation as I parked in that familiar space, the darkness wrapping around me like an embrace. The figures stood where they always did, but this time, there was an air of finality in their stillness. I could sense the weight of every unconfessed secret and the echoed memories of loss and guilt tingling against my skin. I climbed out of my car, the air was thick, my breath hanging in the night, and for the first time, I whispered as if speaking to the darkness itself, "I'm sorry." The figure stepped closer, their silhouette melding with the night until all I could see were their eyes, reflecting the last remnants of daylight. Without a word, they reached behind them and handed me a small, weather-worn object, a keychain, twisted and contorted, that felt oddly warm in my palm. The familiarity ignited the flame of memories, it had been my brother's. Rage and sorrow bubbled within me, the unquenchable need for closure spiraling. I looked up, demanding understanding, but all I saw was a fleeting silhouette being swallowed by the shadows of the trees. I gasped, a hollowness pooling in my chest, as I staggered back to my car, the keychain clutched tightly in my hand. Driving home that night, I didn't know if I freed a piece of my past or if the figure was a reflection of what I still had to confront. The park visits became less frequent, burdened with meaning and unwilling to offer solace like before. Yet, every now and then, as the lonely streetlights flickered past my window, I could see them standing at the edge of the woods on a Tuesday or Thursday. I learned then that the specters we try to avoid often find us in the corners of our minds, waiting to be acknowledged. One afternoon, weeks later, I sat on my couch, that keychain still in my pocket, reflecting on everything I had left unspoken, and felt a pull to those forgotten hours at the park. I could almost hear the rustling whispers beckoning me to return, to sit in silence as darkness enveloped the world outside. No longer did I see the figure as a ghoul of my past but as a guide to my future. So I drove back to the park, ready to face my haunting. When I pulled up, my breath caught in my throat. The figure wasn't there. I felt disoriented, as if I had stumbled into an alternate reality I never knew existed. I opened the car door, stepping onto the grounds rendered barren and brightened by strange lights that flickered just beyond the trees, inviting me closer with their pulse. There, a previous absence in the shadows revealed something far worse. The park pulsed as if it were alive, and I was not alone after all. I took a trembling step forward, the keychain in my pocket heating, an urgency blossoming within me, pulling me toward the heart of the park where the lights beckoned, a truth waiting to engulf me whole. I could feel the figure born from the shadows begin to stretch and weave around me, watching silently, the night alive with stories untold. I didn't think it would come to this, but as I sit here on the stained carpet of my crumbling apartment, the bottle of cheap vodka cradled between my trembling hands, I realize I've surrendered to this disease, the one that lured me in like a siren's song, promising comfort but delivering chains of despair. I used to tell myself that drinking was just a way to cope with life's relentless cruelties, a temporary escape from the noise in my head, but those moments of solace slowly twisted into an insatiable craving, a hunger that gnawed at my sanity. Last night, I crawled my way home from the bar, bloodied knuckles from a fight I couldn't even remember and lips stained with the bitterness of whiskey. But all I clung to was the promise of forgetfulness, at least until the morning light shone through my window and the hangover hit like a freight train. I told myself I'd quit for good. I promised my mom, my sister, anyone who cared enough to listen, but the moment I put an empty glass down, another filled its place. The whispers in my mind grew louder, taunting me as each drink became a desperate attempt to silence them, drowning my regrets with every fiery swallow. Friends drifted away one by one, their concerned looks became too much to bear, and their voices, once warm, transformed into echoes of judgment that only compounded my loneliness. So, I pushed them out, barricaded myself within the four peeling walls of my existence, believing that the soul-crushing isolation would shield me from the world's cold regard. But the worst part of this descent was the reality that I found something oddly comforting in my self-imposed exile. The despair wrapped around me like an old, familiar blanket, soothing yet suffocating, crushing any flicker of hope that dared to ignite. I began having conversations with the shadows that danced in the corners of the room, companions born from the depths of my suffering, sharing secrets and laughter more genuine than any memory of my former life. They were my only friends in this hell I had chosen, and with them, I whispered my failings and fears, and they listened without judgment, no one but them to make me feel the weight of who I had become. Every drink became a ritual, and each evening found me nestled among the ghosts of my own making, telling them how easy it was to forget when the poison burned its way down my throat, how I could almost feel their ethereal hands pushing me away from the unforgiving realities of time and space, until all that was left was an empty room filled with echoes of who I once was. And then, the hallucinations started, a particularly vivid night when I swore that I could see my own mother standing in the kitchen, tears in her eyes, begging me to stop, to come back to the light, her voice fluttering around me like ash from a dying fire, pleading, but instead of reaching for her, I reached for the bottle, trying to drown her out. I let out a hollow laugh because how could I explain to her that the more I drank, the more of my past bled into the present, transforming my heart into a vessel of scars, a reminder that I had betrayed not only myself but those who truly loved me? I thought I could handle it, that I could embrace the darkness that wrapped around my soul, but with each sip, every drop pulled me deeper into a murky abyss where even hope had long ago drowned. There were nights I stumbled outside, the cold biting through my skin, asking whoever might listen for redemption, but I was met with nothing but shadows, the streetlights flickering like taunts above me, each wink a reminder of the life I had forfeited. It was then that I discovered the truth. I didn't just drown my pain in alcohol, I let it fester, transform into a morbid companion I could no longer distinguish from myself. When I finally hit rock bottom, the hazy morning I woke up alone, urine-soaked and shivering in a puddle of my own regrets, surrounded by bottles like sentinels guarding the last remnants of my soul, I realized that surrendering to alcoholism wasn't just about giving up on battling a vice, it was a willingness to accept the whisperings of the shadows, to invite them into the cracks of my being. I called out for help, but the silence that consumed me felt like an old friend that had known me longer than any human ever could. I surrendered, I gave in, I made peace with the demons that clutched at my edges, but in the depths of this acceptance lay something far more sinister than the mere act of pouring that first drink. It was the moment I understood that I wasn't just battling alcoholism, I was welcoming it, begging it to stay, because without it, I was just another lost soul wandering the earth, unseen, unworthy, and utterly alone. So here I sit, with the weight of my surrender pressing down, and I wonder not just how I got here, but what lies ahead now that I've truly given up, whether this will be the closing act of my twisted lullaby or the prelude to an even darker descent where others can only look on, horrified at my devotion to something so utterly destructive. And as I raise the bottle to my lips, a part of me hopes that perhaps it can hold the answers I so desperately seek, even if they are shrouded in sin and self-destruction, because surrendering to alcoholism feels like the ultimate betrayal, not just to those around me but to the very essence of who I once believed I could be. I did a bad thing, and now I have to live with it, a phrase that's become a constant echo in my mind since that night, a night that seemed so ordinary at first, with the cheerful chatter of my friends spilling out of the tavern where we celebrated another year of our lives together, our laughter mingling with the sound of ice clinking in glasses, when a storm rolled in, dark clouds swallowing the moonlight and the air thickened with the scent of rain. We decided to cut the evening short before the weather turned worse, and as I trudged home, using a worn umbrella that barely deflected the downpour, I felt that familiar sense of dread creeping up my spine, the kind that had shadowed me from a young age, a sensation as if the earth was whispering that something was off, but I shrugged it off, dismissing it as nothing more than an overactive imagination until I heard it, a scream that shattered the night like glass, sharp and piercing, echoed in the alleyway to my right. I hesitated, my heart hammering in my chest, torn between the instinct to run and the urge to help, propelled by a desperate need to be a hero even when I felt more like a coward, and so I peered around the corner, my pulse racing, staring into the darkness, but I saw nothing at first, just the glimmer of wet pavement reflecting the dim light from the street. But then I caught a glimpse of movement, a figure hunched over, shaking, their silhouette illuminated by the flickering glow of a lone street lamp. My instinct kicked in, and I pulled my phone from my pocket to call for help, but before I could dial, I watched as a larger shadow emerged, looming over the figure. That was when fear gripped me, paralyzing me, but curiosity, disgustingly twisted, snapped me back to reality. I needed to know what was happening, so I stepped forward, trying to convince myself that I would do something noble, that I was acting bravely, but when I saw the scene unfurl in front of my eyes, my breath caught in my throat, and I felt a savage mix of horror and embarrassment wash over me as the larger figure raised its arm, wielding something glinting, a knife. It was clearly a knife, while the smaller figure was on their knees, begging in a voice thick with panic and desperation, and for a moment, time froze as the electrifying sensation of adrenaline coursed through me, pushing me toward action. I was a witness, just a bystander to an unfolding nightmare, when my body finally decided to listen to reason and turn back, to run for help. But just then, the scream returned and echoed down the alley, frantic, formless, but it ignited a fire in my gut and I bolted back, my feet pounding against the wet concrete as the shadows twisted in chaotic dances around me. I felt like I was peeling away layers of myself, shedding my cowardice and opting for action, but a surge of guilt enveloped me as I swiveled back around, only to find nothing but darkness where the pair had been, and then it hit me. I had done nothing. Not one thing, and I was flooded with an overwhelming sense of helplessness that clung to me like a wet blanket, weighing me down as I staggered into the streetlight's halo. My fingers trembled on my phone, and I finally managed to dial 911, relaying what I'd seen, but the operator's voice felt hollow, distant, and so after hanging up, I stumbled away, crushed under the suffocating weight of my inaction, meticulously replaying the events in my head, that moment of turning back when I could have intervened. Nights turned into weeks, and I tried to bury my guilt beneath a mountain of responsibilities, school, work, pretending I was all right when really I felt tainted. Then the strangest thing happened. A news report blared from my television about a local incident, a homicide in the very same alley, and my heart stopped as I realized it was the same victim, the same place, and in that moment, something detonated within me, a crucible of rage and guilt igniting into an inferno that exacted a terrible toll on my soul. I became obsessed, seeking out every piece of information I could find, reading articles, scrolling through social media, trying to decipher each detail of the victim's life, mourning a stranger while vilifying myself, a shadow lurking in the corners of my mind, whispering that if only I had acted. And then I saw a photo of them, a smiling face surrounded by friends, a glimpse of normalcy stolen forever, and a frenzied urgency compelled me to leave my home, to step into the night where familiarity had turned into a hunting ground, each step punctuated by the echo of my own guilt as I retraced my steps, the rain now a quiet patter against my skin just as it had been that night. I reached the alley, feeling an electric current pulse through my veins as memories surged forth, my cowardice, the knife, the screams. I wanted to cry, to scream, to beg for forgiveness from the sky, and standing at the mouth of the alley, I felt them watching me, felt their presence hovering like a distant smoke cloud, urging me forward, daring me to confront the darkness. With clenched fists and breath hitching in my throat, I took a step inside, immersed in the damp smells of rot and regret, my heart drumming a steady beat against my ribs as I moved deeper into the shadows, drawn toward a palpable weight that felt as if the very night was pulling me into its depths. But as I ventured further, the air became damp, closed in on me, the walls seemed to whisper my name, taunting me, my fear coiling around every heartbeat until everything came to an abrupt halt. A figure emerged from the shadows, gravel crunching underfoot, and I recognized it instantly, the hulking presence of the man from that night. He stood there, looking impossibly larger, more menacing, and instead of screaming, instead of running, I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot as the darkness swirled around me, thick and choking, and as I finally opened my mouth to scream, he lunged forward, whispering something that sent chills cascading down my spine, words slithering into my consciousness, "You'll pay for what you didn't do," and in that moment, the weight of what happened crashed over me like a tidal wave, sealing my fate. I had done a bad thing, one that could never be undone, and now I was bound to carry that burden, both the weight of the past and the dark reality of the future, knowing that even in the light, I would forever be shrouded in shadows, lost in the guilt of my own cowardice. It started with one night of reckless abandon, the kind of night that felt like a neon-lit fever dream, where reality twisted into a blurry mess of laughter and intoxication. I didn't even know her name when we stumbled into my apartment, the air thick with vulnerability and bravado, as we shed our inhibitions along with our clothes. We both knew where it was headed, the magnetic pull of primal instincts overshadowing even the smallest shred of common sense, and when the early morning sunlight began to creep through my window, leaving taco trucks and late-night bars in the rearview mirror, I fully expected that would be the last I'd ever see of her, but then I received a text 3 weeks later that turned my life into a waking nightmare. "I'm pregnant," it read, and even though I had never met a baby trapped, the world pressed in on me so hard that I could hear my heartbeat ricocheting off the walls like a frantic pinball. For a moment, my mind went blank, the panic a tight coil in my chest. I was 26, fresh out of grad school, working a dead-end job in a coffee shop, living with my parents while trying to pay off student loans. I had neither the time nor the resources to welcome new life into such chaos. I tried to reach for rationality, for a way out, but my bravado slipped away like water through seeping cracks, and all I could feel was the suffocating weight of impending responsibility. We met that weekend in a diner, with its flickering neon lights and greasy menus that felt like a cruel joke, as she stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, and I realized she was just as lost as I was. We spent hours fumbling through awkward conversations and half-hearted jokes, but the laughter couldn't cut through the thick fog of anxiety that hung over us, and when she finally said she was thinking of keeping it, my heart collapsed under the weight of dread. Images of sleepless nights, baby cries, and shattered dreams flooded my mind. The thought of us felt like a ghost trapping me, suffocating any chance of freedom or happiness, manifesting a deeper panic. In a moment of desperation, I suggested she consider other options, words woven together with fear and desperation that sent a chill through the diner, mingling with the greasy scent of fries. She left in tears, and I felt a pang of guilt mixed with relief as we went our separate ways, her not knowing where I had just trapped myself, lost in the shadows, resonating echoes of my own decisions haunting me. The next few weeks were a blur of manic existence, trying to avoid her calls, dodging text messages, and deceiving myself into thinking that maybe, just maybe, I could live this life unscathed, like running from a nightmare that kept unfurling in the recesses of my mind. But it didn't stop. Out of nowhere, I grew sick during the nights, not from the anxiety of what awaited but from something deeper and darker, a sensation that felt more like a presence, tightening around my throat like a slow strangulation, and when I finally sought help, the doctor looked into my eyes and said, "There's nothing physically wrong, but maybe you're just stressed out." And so the weeks dragged on, with my existence narrowing into the oddly cozy confines of my own panic, watching shadows dance on the walls, feeling like a prisoner in my own skin, as I realized I was disappearing, fading with each yawn, each ounce of energy slipping away like dust in the wind, reducing me to nothing more than a wisp, a ghost of who I once was. The night I changed felt particularly vivid. I looked in the mirror and saw it, the hollow cheeks, the sunken eyes staring back at me, but now it wasn't just a reflection, it was as if someone else was staring back, a stranger peering from behind the glass, and I barely registered the pounding on my door until it shattered my trance. Before I could react, before the panic could turn into a response, a violent crash sent splinters across the floor, and there she was, the girl from that fateful night, her face twisted in anger and desperation, red and raw like she had clawed her way through a thorny bush. "I needed to tell you," she gasped, and before she could complete her thought, a shudder crawled down my spine, and I knew she wasn't alone. I was swallowed by darkness, the door collapsing, pushed aside, and there it was, the presence I had suffocated beneath my panicked thoughts, standing behind her, an amalgamation of shadow and texture, as if distorted memories rolled into one sepulchral being, and I realized too late that it wasn't just my fear manifesting. As the silhouette expanded like smoke curling into the room, it filled the space with an icy dread radiating from nowhere and everywhere, echoing like a forgotten despair, and a frantic energy surged within me to run, but my legs felt like concrete. It was a horrifying truth, I was trapped within my own demise, like I had become both the phantasm and the prisoner, witnessing my life slip away as if I were spectating in a theater of the damned. "What's happening?" she screamed, while a light trembled against the onslaught of shadows, and I wanted to shout, to tell her to run, but my voice was lost between realms, trapped like I was, fated and fating. I watched helplessly as the creature reached for her, the rejection of destiny played out in Casablanca tones, fear brewing as she shrieked, and the last visible remnants of life I possessed swirled into the abyss, where the lines of mortality and spirit blurred. I felt it in that moment, the truth that settled in, that I had strived to escape and now welcomed with open arms, a realization that I had become truly a ghost, wandering the earth, forever shackled by my own choices, encircled by my demons while the living blinked and danced around me, unaware that I could only watch, freezing in horror as life unfolded without me, trapped not by a baby, but by the weight of my own regrets as I drifted along the edges of darkness. I woke up today with a heavy chest, the kind of weight that sits on you like a bad dream refusing to fade, and I knew it was the day I had finally decided to take action, an end to the pain that had become my life. I lived in a constant haze of despair, marked by the spiral of isolation and anxiety that had consumed me over the past few months, painted in shades of gray that dulled the edges of everything I used to love. At my lowest, I sketched it all out in my mind, an escape plan that had taken shape in the bleak recesses of my thoughts. I spent the day preparing, gathering items that would make this shadowy decision a simpler affair, a rope hidden in the garage, a few well-placed notes for my family that I hoped would convey my love amidst my departure. I didn't want any grand send-off, I only desired a quiet end to my struggle, something serene, beautiful even, like the closure of a book you couldn't put down because it hurt too much to read. My close friend, Jacob, texted me that morning, completely unaware of my plans, inviting me to one of his late-night sonatas that I had skipped countless times before. I almost laughed at how normal everything felt, my heart aching with unfulfilled longing to simply say yes and join him, but I quickly silenced the thought. Instead, I prepared myself for the night ahead, making sure to plot a route that would lead me straight back home after I said my goodbyes. There was a tension in the air as evening fell, an electricity that pulsed through me, intertwining with fear and a sickening sense of relief. When I arrived at Jacob's house, surrounded by the flicker of candlelight and hushed laughter, his eyes lit up as he embraced me tightly, pulling me into the warmth of his company, even as I felt myself slipping further away into the dark corners of my mind. The music floated like a haunting melody, sometimes soothing, sometimes unsettling, and I lost myself in thought, imagining what would happen as soon as I left the gathering. Jacob played beautifully, pouring his heart into the instrument that had woven so many memories for us, each note resting heavy in the air, laden with unsaid words. I felt the pulse of something within me, a wavering heartbeat of hope rising up just as quickly as my resolve crumbled, and I knew then that I had to leave without him ever knowing. But just as I stood to slip away, I heard him call my name, a simple word that shattered my carefully crafted facade. "Are you okay?" he asked, concern etching itself onto his face, and I forced a smile, telling him about the usual stresses of life, pretending the weight on my chest didn't threaten to crush me. Jacob stared into my eyes as if searching for answers I couldn't give him, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of understanding in his gaze, as if he knew more than I had let on. I didn't want to burden him with my demons, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was more aware of my darkness than I realized. After a while, he pulled me aside, away from the lively banter of our friends, and shared a story, one he said had changed his perspective on life. It was about hope, resilience, and the simple fact that when someone is in despair, a single person can spark a series of events that alters their fate completely. The words wrapped around me, squeezing the air from my lungs, as I felt the duality of my decision weigh against the importance of his message. Just then, the lights flickered ominously, plunging the room into darkness for a heartbeat, a cosmic joke, a signal from the universe that I had yet to grasp fully. My mind skittered back to my plans, and with each passing second, I felt the binds of my resolve loosening under the weight of his sincerity. When the lights returned, I caught a glimpse of something almost imperceptible within Jacob's eyes, a glimmer of intuition that set my skin alight and kindled a hesitant flame of connection I thought lost, an understanding beyond the surface. It broke something in me, and suddenly, I couldn't think about slipping away, because he had wrenched me back from the edge just by being there, without even knowing it. I didn't tell him about my thoughts of escape, perhaps I didn't need to. The truth was, I'd been standing on the precipice, peering into an abyss that whispered promises of peace, and he had somehow illuminated the darker paths with his presence. By the end of the night, I made a promise to myself, to reach out, to talk more, to still the whisperings of despair that loomed so constantly in my life. As we parted ways, Jacob smiled and hugged me again. But this time it felt different. This time, as I looked into his eyes, I realized that maybe I was worth saving. I didn't know how deep the shadow went, or if I'd ever fully escape, but with friends like him, maybe I wouldn't have to fight the darkness alone anymore. Later that night, lying in bed, I could feel the old weight still hanging around, but somehow it felt lighter, like a burden shared rather than one I carried alone. I drifted into sleep with a flicker of something resembling hope, not knowing that every note of love and joy wrapped in those melodies had silently crept into the corners of my heart, saving me from what could have been my final attempt today. I didn't give him the job because his kid is a jerk, and I hate myself for it now. It started out as a standard hiring process for a position at the small tech company I managed, We had several applicants, but Jay Davis caught my attention. His resume was impressive, a testament to his skills and experience, but it was his glowing recommendations that really swayed me. People praised his professionalism, his insight, his ability to work miracles with code. I wanted nothing more than to welcome him aboard, but then I met his son, Timmy. I can still vividly remember the day Jay brought him along to the interview. My office door was ajar when I saw Timmy standing outside, a scruffy kid no older than 10 with an unkempt mop of hair that seemed to bounce as he paced in front of my office. He was clutching a toy robot, jaw set in defiance, clearly bored and uninterested. When Jay asked Timmy to sit quietly, the boy rolled his eyes and plopped down in the corner, ignoring his father completely. Jay started talking about his background, and as he did, I couldn't shake the feeling that Timmy was staring daggers at me. I tried not to focus on him but caught him muttering under his breath, something about how he hoped I wouldn't take his dad's job away from him like some kind of ominous threat. All throughout the interview, I felt like I was being observed, scrutinized by someone far too young to understand the complexities of adult life. When Jay excused himself to take a phone call, I couldn't help but look over at Timmy, whose face twisted in a pout as he cradled the robot, his expression darkening whenever a smile flickered across my face. Just then, my assistant walked by and casually mentioned that Timmy had been bothering the other employees in the waiting area, demanding they play with him or calling them losers for being too adult. I felt a terrible conflict churning in my stomach. Jay was perfect for the role, though that boy was an absolute nightmare, and I was torn between professionalism and the worry of what would happen if I brought on an employee with such an obnoxious child. I didn't have time for disrupted sessions or thrown tantrums. The company was already on shaky ground, and I was the one responsible for keeping it afloat. So as Jay returned to my office, I maneuvered for an excuse and let my hesitation spill out in a vague discomfort, the emotional turmoil roiling within me as I fabricated a lie about needing someone with more experience. Jay's face fell. He looked crestfallen, and for a fleeting moment, I wished I could take it all back, but Timmy was watching me with an unsettling grin, as if he knew I had made the right choice, as if there was no chance in hell I'd be getting rid of him anytime soon. I forced myself to shake off the guilt and reminded myself that I had made the best decision for the company, but I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that justice was waiting just outside my office door. Reservations mingled with curiosity as days turned into weeks following that interview. I watched the other potential hires flourish or flounder, and every time Jay's name popped up on my screen, his applications to other companies, his social media updates showcasing just how incredible he was, I bit my lip, torn between relief and creepy fascination. But the more I read, the more I felt something was off about Timmy. Posts about them together, Jay and that brat, showed Timmy looking more sinister than before. Even his questions seemed designed to push buttons, as if he reveled in torturing adults. I tried not to think too much of it, until one fateful evening when I received a notification that sent ice prickling down my spine. Jay posted a video to his feed titled "What My Son Can Do." I watched it with bated breath, my heart racing, the warm glow of my screen illuminating my face as I saw Timmy. Only, he was different, older, wearing a hoodie, and surrounded by other kids who looked just like him, eyes dark and expressive, as they chanted hypnotically. The camera zoomed in on Timmy, excitement glistening in his eyes as he held the same robot from before, but it blinked ominously, mechanical limbs twisting in an unnatural dance. I couldn't tear my eyes away in horror. Each flash of their smug, taunting smiles felt like daggers piercing my gut. The chant echoed through my ears, and the connection struck me like lightning. It can find you. It can always find you. I didn't want to believe it, but I remembered the way Timmy stared at me in that office, the crushing weight of his gaze. I thought it was merely a child's interest, but I realized it was so much more, a predator's gaze. That night, sleep eluded me as I wrestled with my thoughts. What kind of kid mates with robots? What kind of father encourages that? All I could think of was how I had wanted to protect my company, my employees, and, most importantly, myself from that smug little devil. The chance that I could have hit Jay, a talented employee, and been rid of that wretched kid gnawed at the edges of my mind like a relentless itch. Days later, I stumbled across a chilling thread buried in a forum. Some people were talking about mysterious disappearances linked to robotic toys, and it all seemed like coincidental chatter until I read the last post. They know where you are. They always know. It was signed simply as a parent. And, suddenly, all the puzzle pieces clicked. Jay had been the common factor in all these incidents. I recalled that night, shadows creeping along my walls, hearing strange whirring outside my window, and then silence fell over my home like a thick blanket. I stepped outside, heart racing, locking eyes with the hulking silhouette of a robot shaped like Timmy's toy in the distance. My breaths grew shallow. I read the words of the parent over and over again until their essence sank into my soul. That's when I made the decision to confront Jay, to warn him about the dark world his son was threading them into. But when I finally called him, his voice was hollow, coated with an unsettling calm, almost as if there was a barrier between us, a stretch of dread woven into every syllable. "Timmy has a gift," he said, his tone eerily cheerful. "You should be proud of him. He's smarter than any of us." I hung up, fingers trembling in disbelief, some part of me knowing that I had just brushed my fingers against something incredibly sinister. Days turned into a long spiral of paranoia. I searched for every connection I could within that forum and watched Timmy's posts evolve into grotesque spectacles. The videos morphed into something else altogether, a twisted extravaganza with Timmy at the center, surrounded by wheeled creations. I was ensnared, bewitched, doubting myself, wondering if I had done the right thing by denying Jay the position. One afternoon, my assistant rushed in, eyes wide and distraught. "Have you seen the news?" I had barely sat down when the report blared through the air, headlines about kids across the city going missing, linked to a mysterious boy who congregated others in their homes, dressed in hoodies like ghouls addressing the lost in a diluted ceremony. My heart raced as she looked at me, asking if I knew anything about Timmy. I felt the weight of my decision crash down like a tidal wave, and that night, I laid blankets across my windowsills as I heard the distant whirring, that unmistakable sound that reminded me of childhood nightmares. I watched the street under a cautious gaze, terrified of that twisted robot apparition, hoping I had done enough to protect my family from whatever had emerged. But then, caught within my paranoia, I felt my phone buzz, and a new notification glimmered in the dark, a message from Jay that read, "Timmy wants to meet you." I wanted to laugh, to scream, but instead, I felt impotent. In the pool of fluorescent light, I clasped the sheets around me, heart pounding so viciously that I could hardly breathe, worried that in saying no to a father's ambition I had awakened something insatiable, an evil creature born in the guise of a child everyone ignored, leading into the night with a lost grin and the glint of metal. Eventually, I fell asleep, but the last thing I remember before the dream took me was the primal instinct of terror wrapping around my throat, echoing a warning deep inside, "It can always find you." Just before I woke, shivering, as the sound of soft giggles danced through my open window, whispering the name of my darkest fears, the name of a boy whose father I had wronged, who, unbeknownst to me, was living a nightmare far darker than any choice I had made.